The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in November, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the sun came out that morning for the first time in 2 weeks. Like the sky had no idea what kind of day it was. Some people who know the full story say I was ruthless. A few of my husband's relatives have called me calculating. His mother, Rosalind Ferreira, told anyone who would listen that I was cold-blooded and that her son deserved better. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because everything you are about to hear is the reason I no longer lose sleep over what Rosalind Ferreira thinks of me. My name is Claire. I was married to Daniel Ferreira for 9 years, and on the day I received a cancer diagnosis that would have leveled most people to the floor, my husband announced he was leaving for his mother's 60th birthday party. Not the next day, not later that week. That same afternoon. He looked at me across the kitchen counter, and he said, "The party is more important." He actually said it, out loud, with his whole chest. I did not cry. I did not beg. I picked up my phone and called my attorney, Valeria Ochoa, and asked her to accelerate the filing timeline we had spent 4 months quietly preparing. Then I went upstairs, ironed a blouse, came back down, and handed Daniel the divorce papers at the dinner table while he was eating the pasta he had made, apparently unbothered, before his big trip to celebrate his mother. I said, "I will be in the hospital for the next several days, but you should know that I filed this morning." He stared at the envelope for a long time, then he looked up at me. He opened his mouth. And for once in 9 years, Daniel Ferreira had absolutely nothing to say. Let me tell you how we got here. Daniel and I met when I was 27 at a conference in Atlanta. He was charming in a way that felt specific to me at the time, and looking back, I understand that it was specific to everyone, that Daniel had a particular talent for making whoever he was talking to feel like the only person in a room. We dated for 2 years, got engaged, and married in the fall of a year that feels like it belongs to a different woman entirely. The wedding was beautiful. Rosalind cried. I thought those were happy tears. The Ferreira family was large, loud, and deeply certain of its own opinions. Rosalind had raised 4 children mostly on her own after her husband passed, and she wore that sacrifice like a second skin. There was nothing wrong with that, in principle. What was wrong was the way it translated into a belief that her judgment on every subject, including my life, was not just welcome but required. Daniel's sister, Marta, was the quieter version of the same tendency. She had a habit of tilting her head when I spoke, like she was translating something from a language she considered beneath her. Daniel's younger brother, Tomas, was mostly harmless but constitutionally incapable of contradicting his mother, which made him a kind of passive accomplice to everything that followed. Within the first year of our marriage, I understood the shape of things. I was tolerated. I was not embraced. Rosalind had wanted Daniel to marry a woman named Claudia, whom he had dated briefly before me, and she kept Claudia's name alive in the conversation the way people keep candles burning. Just at the edge of the room, flickering, you could always smell the smoke. The incidents that I remember most clearly are not the dramatic ones, they are the small, surgical ones. The first happened at a Ferreira family dinner about 8 months after the wedding. I had just closed a consulting contract that represented more money than I had ever seen in a single transaction. I could not talk about the details, but I was, to put it plainly, riding a wave of quiet professional pride. Rosalind passed me the bread basket and told me, in a voice like she was doing me a favor, that her friend's dental office was hiring a receptionist, and that the hours were very reasonable for a young woman still figuring things out. I smiled and took the bread. I did not correct her. That night, I transferred the first installment from the new contract into the investment account I had opened 6 months earlier, and which no one in the Ferreira family knew existed. I had read somewhere that the best response to someone underestimating you is to simply keep building, and I had decided to take that advice with a level of commitment that might have seemed excessive at the time. The second incident was a year later. Marta and I were in the kitchen at Rosalind's house, loading the dishwasher after a Sunday lunch, and Marta mentioned that a friend of hers had started a small catering business and was doing reasonably well. She turned to look at me, head slightly tilted. Have you thought about something like that? Something a little more creative, a little more manageable? You always seemed like more of a creative type than a business type, if you know what I mean. I knew exactly what she meant. She meant she had decided, without any real information, that I was not particularly capable. I said I would think about it. The next morning, I signed an agreement that brought a second major client into my consulting practice, a firm that would go on to represent the largest single revenue source I had ever managed. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, then you know exactly what that silence feels like. You know how it sits in your chest. And you know what it feels like to let it harden into something useful instead of something destructive. The third incident was subtler, and in some ways worse. It was at a birthday party for Tomas's son, and at some point the conversation turned to a neighborhood not far from the city where several of the Ferreira cousins had recently bought homes. Daniel mentioned that we had been thinking about buying a house, and Rosalind, without looking up from her plate, said, "You two should be realistic about what you can afford. Not cruel, just certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't need evidence because it has never been challenged." Daniel laughed it off. I smiled and refilled my glass of water. I did not mention that I had met with a real estate attorney 3 weeks earlier and had begun the process of identifying properties that would allow me to keep significant assets in my name alone. A process I had initiated not because I was planning to leave Daniel at that point, but because Valeria Ochoa, my attorney, had advised me very early in my professional life to never let convenience make you legally vulnerable. It was advice I had taken seriously, and I was about to be very glad I had. The consulting practice I had built over the previous several years was not a secret in the way a hidden bank account is a secret. It was simply private. I worked from home, mostly. I had a small dedicated office on the second floor of our house that Daniel knew existed but had never shown much interest in. He understood in a general way that I did consulting work in the financial sector and that I was reasonably successful at it, but Daniel had a fundamental lack of curiosity about my professional life that I had mistaken for respect for my autonomy and later recognized as indifference. He never asked about clients. He never asked about revenue. When I occasionally mentioned a project, his eyes would glaze over in the way eyes do when someone is being polite but not present. This suited me, in retrospect, more than I realized at the time. By the 4th year of our marriage, the practice had grown well beyond anything I had imagined when I started it. I had 3 long-term retainer clients, each representing a substantial annual commitment and a rotating portfolio of project-based work that filled the gaps. My accountant, a meticulous woman named Bernadette Cho, had restructured my business entity twice in response to growth I hadn't fully anticipated. She had a habit of looking at my quarterly numbers and saying, in a tone of mild professional surprise, "Well, just that word. Well." I had come to find it enormously satisfying. I kept the practice private from the Ferreira family for reasons that had started as professional discretion and gradually became something more deliberate. Early on, I simply didn't want the scrutiny. My work required confidentiality, and I had seen what happened to family members who made the mistake of discussing money openly in that household. Every figure became a reference point for judgment, for comparison, for the establishment of some informal hierarchy that Rosalind presided over with absolute authority. But as the years passed and the pattern became clear, the privacy became strategic. I was building something. And I was building it in a house where someone consistently told the table that I was not a business type, that I should be realistic about what I could afford, that the receptionist job had very reasonable hours. I made a decision, conscious and deliberate, to let them keep believing what they believed and to keep building. There were close calls. The first one that stands out happened at Rosalind's house on a Sunday afternoon about 6 years into our marriage. I had left my laptop open on the kitchen counter while I went upstairs to get a sweater, which in retrospect was careless, and when I came back down, Marta was standing at the counter with her head tilted at the screen. I crossed the room in what I hope was a natural pace. "That is a lot of numbers," she said. "It is," I said. I closed the laptop. "Is that your work?" "Some of it." She looked at me for a moment. "Are you doing some kind of side project?" "Something like that," I said, and I smiled in the way I had learned to smile, which was warm enough to end a conversation without inviting another one. She glanced at the laptop again. "Daniel mentioned you had been really busy lately." "Daniel does not always know how busy I am," I said, still smiling. I picked up the laptop and my glass of water. "Can I bring you anything from the fridge?" She said no. She watched me leave the room. In the hallway, I let myself breathe. Later that evening, I called Bernadette and asked her to make sure that the most visible account statements were accessible only through a separate login that required 2-factor authentication. She said, of course, and then paused. Should I be concerned? I told her not yet. She said, well, in the tone she used, and I felt the small, clean click of another precaution falling into place. The second close call was more dangerous because it involved Daniel directly, which had not happened before. We were sitting in the living room on an ordinary weeknight in the 7th year of our marriage, and he had been unusually quiet all evening. Eventually, he said, my mother mentioned she saw some kind of financial dashboard on your computer. I put down the book I was reading. She saw some numbers, I said. What kind of numbers? Business numbers, quarterly summaries. He was quiet for a moment. How much business are we talking about? Enough to keep me busy. He looked at me. His expression was not suspicious exactly. It was more like someone who has just realized that a room they thought they knew has a door they never noticed. Claire, he said, are we talking about significant money? I looked at him carefully. We are talking about my professional work, I said. Which I have been doing for 7 years. Which you have always been welcome to ask about. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He pulled at the fabric on the arm of the couch, which was what he always did when he was processing something he didn't have language for yet. I'm not hiding anything from you, I said, which was technically true. I simply have not volunteered detailed financial summaries at the dinner table because I am a private person about professional matters. You know this about me. He looked at me for another moment. Then he nodded. Then he went back to watching television. I went upstairs and called Valeria. I told her about the conversation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said in the precise, measured way she always spoke, it may be time to accelerate some of the structural protections we discussed. I said, I agree. She said, I will need about 2 weeks to prepare the documentation. I said, take whatever time you need. But please start tomorrow. I came back downstairs. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch. I turned off the television and sat in the armchair across from him for a while, looking at the face of a man I had been married to for 7 years, and I tried to locate the feeling I used to have when I looked at him, the specific warmth, the ease. I found traces of it. Echoes. But the room had changed, and I knew it, and I think some part of me had known it for longer than I wanted to admit. I did not know then what the next 18 months would bring. I did not know about the diagnosis, or about the party, or about the exact words he would say to me across the kitchen counter on the day my world could have fallen apart and instead simply clarified. I did not know that I had exactly the time I had, and not a day more. But I had started. Everything was moving. And the Ferreira family, gathered at their Sunday lunches and their birthday parties and their casual assessments of what I could and could not accomplish, had absolutely no idea what was already in motion. The timing, as it turned out, would prove to be either the worst possible luck or the most precise thing that had ever happened to me. I am still not entirely sure which. What I know is that, when Daniel walked through the front door one evening in the early spring, looking the way he always looked when he had news he was not sure how to deliver, and told me that his mother had begun planning a significant party for her 60th birthday, and that it would require the full attention and presence of every member of the family, I nodded and said that sounded lovely. I asked what date she had in mind. He told me. I looked at the calendar on my phone for a moment longer than necessary. That date meant nothing to me then. It would not mean nothing for long. I set my phone face down on the counter. I asked if he wanted coffee. He said yes. And neither of us said anything else about it, which I now understand was the most important conversation we never had. Because in the space of that silence, everything that followed was already waiting. The appointment had been scheduled for a Wednesday in late March. A follow-up to what my doctor had called, in the careful language doctors use when they are not ready to be specific, a finding that warranted closer attention. I had known something was wrong for about 6 weeks before the appointment, the way you sometimes know things before anyone confirms them, not dramatically, not with dread exactly, but with a low, steady certainty that sits at the back of your mind while you go about the business of your ordinary days. I had told Daniel about the original scan results. He had nodded in the way he nodded when I told him things that required him to hold information he found uncomfortable, a single firm nod, like he was filing it away in a folder he did not intend to open again soon. He had said, I'm sure it will be fine. I had said, I hope so, and that had been the whole conversation. The Wednesday appointment was at 10 in the morning. I drove myself. Daniel had a work thing, he said, a meeting he could not move. I told him it was fine. I had Valeria on speed dial and Bernadette in my contacts, and the name of a very good oncologist that a colleague had recommended 8 months earlier. During a conversation I had tucked away with the same quiet precision I applied to most things in my life. The diagnosis was breast cancer. Early stage, the doctor said, which was the best version of the news I could have received, and I want to be clear that I understood that. I was not without gratitude for that word, early. But I sat in that office with the paper gown crinkling every time I moved, and I listened to the treatment plan and the timeline and the words surgery and radiation, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, I need to make some calls. I drove home. I did not cry in the car. I have always been better at processing things in motion, and the 40-minute drive back to the house gave me enough time to build the sequence in my head. Call Valeria first. Call Bernadette second. Tell Daniel when he gets home, give him the evening to absorb it. Deal with whatever came next. Daniel was already home when I got there. He was in the kitchen, on the phone, and when he saw my face, he held up one finger, the universal signal for give me a minute, and continued his conversation. I set my bag down on the counter and waited. He finished the call, put his phone in his pocket, and looked at me. I told him about the diagnosis. I was direct. I told him what the doctor had said, what the plan was, and approximately what the next several months would look like in terms of appointments and procedures. I watched his face while I talked. There was a sequence of expressions that moved across it like weather, something that looked like shock, then something that looked like calculation, and then something I had not expected, which was a kind of bracing. The particular way a person's shoulders settle when they have made a decision and are about to say something they know is going to land badly. He said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. He told me that his mother's 60th birthday party was on Saturday. That he had known for months that he had committed to being there, and that given everything involved in the planning, everything his family had put into it, he did not see how he could cancel. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. And then, because Daniel Ferreira had never been a person who understood when silence was the wiser choice, he said it. He said, "The party is more important. Not more important than a party. Not I have to be there for my family." He said the party is more important. Present tense, absolute, as though it were simply a fact of physics that he was helpfully clarifying. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from where I was standing. I felt something shift inside me, not break, not shatter, but shift, the way a large piece of furniture shifts when you finally push it all the way to the wall it was always supposed to rest against. Something finding its permanent position. I said, "Okay." He seemed relieved. He said he was sorry, that he hoped I understood that his mother had been counting on this for a long time. I said, "I understand perfectly." He left the kitchen. I heard the television go on in the other room. I picked up my phone and called Valeria. She answered on the second ring. Before I could say anything beyond her name, she said, "Claire." "Are you all right?" I said, "I need to move up the timeline. Can we file by Friday?" There was a brief pause. She said, "I can have everything ready by Thursday afternoon if you can come in tomorrow morning." I said, "I will be there at 9. She said, "I'll have the paralegal pull everything tonight." I said, "Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow." I ended the call. I stood in the kitchen for another moment, listening to the sound of the television from the next room, the low murmur of whatever Daniel was watching. The evening light came through the window over the sink and landed on the counter in a long, pale stripe. I looked at it for a moment, and then I went upstairs, opened my laptop, and sent Bernadette an email flagging that some significant financial restructuring would be happening in the next 30 to 60 days and asking her to be available for a call the following week. Then I went back downstairs and made dinner. Daniel ate without talking much. He said the pasta was good. I said thank you. We watched the news. He went to bed early. I stayed up until nearly midnight going through the binder Valeria had prepared 6 weeks earlier, the one I had kept in the locked drawer of my office desk, the one that laid out, in precise and organized detail, every asset, every account, every entity structure that had been quietly and legally established over the previous 3 years. I read through it like I was reviewing a project plan, which is essentially what it was. By the time I turned out the light, I was not angry. I was not sad. I was focused in the particular way I get focused when I have a clear objective and a workable timeline, and I felt, underneath all of it, something that I can only describe as the specific calm of a woman who has been preparing for something for a long time and has just been handed her start signal. If you are still with me, stay. Because what I did next is the reason I am telling you this story. The meeting with Valeria on Thursday morning lasted 2.5 hours. She walked me through every document with the methodical thoroughness that had made her indispensable to me since I hired her 4 years earlier. She had a habit of lining up papers in a perfectly straight row before she discussed them, squaring each corner, and I had always found it oddly steadying. Order before complexity. Here is what we have. Here is how it works. The divorce filing was comprehensive. The asset documentation was complete. The business valuation, which Bernadette had prepared as part of a routine annual review process that Daniel had never once inquired about, placed the current worth of my consulting practice at a number that would, when it became part of the court record, constitute the single most significant piece of information Daniel Ferreira had never bothered to ask about in 9 years of marriage. Valeria lined up the last page. She squared the corner. She looked at me across the desk. "Are you sure about the timing? Given everything else you're managing right now," I said, "the timing is exactly right. If I wait until after treatment, I lose leverage on the asset protection structures we set up. If I file now, everything is already in place." She nodded once, the way she does when she agrees but wants to make sure I have thought it through. "You know he's going to be surprised." I said, "I know." She said, "His family is going to be very surprised." I picked up my coffee cup. I said, "I'm counting on it." She allowed herself a very small smile. The papers were filed with the court at 4:47 that Thursday afternoon. Valeria's assistant, a young man named Jorge, who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned the value of discretion, called me to confirm when it was done. I was sitting in the parking lot of my oncologist's office at the time, waiting for a pre-surgical consultation that I had scheduled for Friday morning. I thanked Jorge and told him to pass along my thanks to Valeria. He said of course, and that Valeria had also asked him to tell me she would be in touch about next steps on Monday. I said, "Tell her Monday works perfectly." Daniel left for his mother's party on Saturday morning. He packed a bag the night before, which meant he was staying over, which meant that Rosalind's celebration had not only superseded my diagnosis, but had done so in a way that required an overnight commitment. He kissed me on the cheek before he left. He said, "I hope the appointment goes okay." He meant the pre-surgical consultation, which I had mentioned the previous day in the same tone I might use to mention a dentist visit. I said, "I'm sure it will be fine." He picked up his bag. He walked out the front door. I watched his car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and let myself feel the full weight of what was happening for exactly 3 minutes. I had decided on 3 minutes. I had given myself that. After 3 minutes, I got up, washed my face, made coffee, and called my sister Nora, who was the only person in my life who knew the full picture and who had been waiting, as she later told me, for this call for about 2 years. She said, "It happened." I said, "It happened." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm going to be." She drove over that afternoon, and we sat at the kitchen table for several hours. And it was the first time in a very long time that I felt like the room I was sitting in actually belonged to me. Rosalind Ferreira's 60th birthday party was held at the home of her eldest son, a large house in a suburb I had driven to many times over the years without ever feeling entirely welcome in it. It was the kind of house that had a name, in the way some families name their houses, as though the building itself needed an identity. It was called Terrace House, which I had always found slightly absurd. There was no terrace. There was a deck. By the time Daniel came home on Sunday evening, the papers had been filed for approximately 52 hours. He did not know this. He came in looking the way people look after family gatherings that required more emotional performance than they had budgeted for, slightly deflated, carrying a container of leftover birthday cake that Rosalind had sent home with him. He set the cake on the counter. I had made dinner. The table was set. I told him to sit down. He sat down. He served himself. He started eating and told me in a tone of mild obligation that the party had been lovely, that his mother had cried when everyone sang, that Marta had organized the photos into a slideshow. I let him finish a few bites. Then I placed the envelope on the table beside his plate. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "What is this?" I said, "I will be in the hospital for the first stage of my treatment starting Tuesday, but you should know that I filed this on Thursday. Everything you need is in there." He looked at the envelope for a long time without touching it. Then he looked up. His face did something I had not seen it do before. It was not anger, and it was not the blankness I might have expected. It was something more complicated, a kind of reckoning. like a man who has just understood in a single moment all the things he chose not to understand while he still had time. He said, "Claire." I said, "I know." He said, "The party." I said, "Yes. The party." He pushed his plate away from him very slowly, not in anger, just in the absence of appetite, and he sat there with his hands flat on the table, and he did not say anything else for a long time. There was nothing left to say that would have changed the filing date, or the diagnosis, or the 9 years of Sunday lunches at Terrace House where I had smiled and passed the bread basket and kept building quietly in the room above the garage, while everyone at the table made decisions about what I was and what I was not capable of. He picked up the envelope. He did not open it. He stood up. He took his overnight bag, which he had not yet unpacked, and he went upstairs. I heard him up there for a while. Then I heard him come back down, and the front door open and close, and the sound of his car in the driveway. I finished my dinner. I cleaned up the kitchen. I went upstairs to bed. The formal confrontation, if you can call it that, happened 11 days later. I was 4 days out of my first surgical procedure, operating on considerably less sleep than I would have liked, and I had told Valeria that I preferred to do it at her office rather than in a room that would require me to see Rosalind's face across my own furniture. Valeria had agreed without hesitation. She had booked the conference room for 2 hours, which turned out to be exactly right. Daniel arrived with his brother Tomas, who had apparently been designated as a form of moral support, and with a lawyer named Jeffrey Adler, who had the look of a man who had been brought in quickly and had not yet fully grasped what he was walking into. Valeria and I were already seated. I had worn a blazer over a soft shirt because I was still sore and wanted to move comfortably, and I had my hair pulled back, and I had slept as well as I could the night before, and I felt, sitting at that table, more like myself than I had felt in years. Jeffrey Adler set his briefcase on the table and opened it. He looked at Valeria. He said, "We'd like to start with a discussion of the marital asset inventory." Valeria slid a document across the table. Jeffrey picked it up. He read the first page. He turned to the second. His expression did not change, but there was a stillness that came over him, a pause that lasted 2 seconds too long, and I watched him understand, page by page, that whatever Daniel had told him about the financial landscape of this marriage was not remotely accurate. Daniel, across the table, was watching me, not the document. Me. He had not looked at the document yet. He was looking at me the way a person looks at someone when they are trying to determine how much the other person knows, and the answer in this case was everything. Jeffrey placed the document flat on the table. He looked at Daniel. He kept his voice professionally even. He said, "Were you aware of the scope of your wife's business holdings?" Daniel said, "I knew she had a consulting practice." Jeffrey's hand rested on the document. "The scope of it," he said again. Daniel looked at the document for the first time. He turned to the second page. His hand went to the arm of his chair and stopped there, gripping the edge. "The consulting practice," Valeria said calmly, "was established in the 7th year of the marriage and is currently valued at approximately $1.4 million based on the most recent independent appraisal, which you will find on page 4. The business entity is structured separately from the marital estate in accordance with a prenuptial addendum that both parties signed, which you will find on page 7. Daniel turned to page 4, then to page 7. He read the addendum. He set the papers down. His voice came out quieter than his speaking voice usually was. He said, "I don't remember signing this." Valeria said, "Your signature is on page 8, witnessed and notarized, dated March of 2019. At the time, you were presented with the document as part of a routine estate planning update. Your attorney at the time, whose name appears on the witness line, can confirm." Daniel turned to page 8. He looked at his own signature for a long time. He looked at the date. He looked at me. Tomas, who had been sitting to Daniel's left in the careful stillness of a man who had not expected any of this, cleared his throat very quietly and looked at the wall to his left. Jeffrey said, "We'll need time to review this in full." Valeria said, "Of course, you have 30 days under the filing terms. However, given the documented asset values and the existing structural protections, I would suggest that your client's position is substantially more limited than may have been initially understood." Page 12 outlines the proposed division, which I believe you'll find is fair and reflects the legal separations that were established at the time of each asset's formation. Jeffrey turned to page 12. He read it. He put the papers face down on the table, which was the first time I had ever seen an attorney put papers face down, and he said he needed a moment with his client. We stepped out. Valeria poured herself a glass of water from the credenza in the hallway. She handed me one. She said he didn't know about any of it. I said, I know. She said, not the valuation, not the addendum, not the separate entity structure. I said, he never asked. She held her glass in both hands and looked at me with the expression she uses when she respects something but isn't sure it required her saying so. Then she said, you know, his attorney is going to argue coercion on the addendum. I said, let them argue. She nodded. They'll lose. They would lose because Daniel had had his own lawyer present when he signed, and because the signature was witnessed and notarized, and because there was no evidence of coercion, only evidence of a man who had signed a document his attorney had explained to him and then spent 3 years failing to inquire about the financial life of the woman he was married to. That was not coercion. That was inattention. And inattention, as it turns out, is not a legal defense. We went back into the conference room. Daniel looked at me across the table. His face had settled into something that was past the calculations and past the reckoning. It was something quieter, closer to grief, maybe, but not the grief of someone who had lost something they valued. More like the grief of someone who has just understood the full dimension of what they failed to value while they had it. He said, when did you start planning this? I said, I started protecting my assets professionally in the 2nd year of our marriage. I started preparing for this specific outcome about 18 months ago. He said, because of my mother. I said, because of a pattern of behavior that involved you and your mother, and a fundamental absence of regard that I tried to address directly on 3 separate occasions, each of which you will find documented in Appendix B. Jeffrey made a note. Tomas looked at the table. Daniel said you were planning this while we were still together, while we were living in the house. My voice was level. I said, Daniel, I was also building a $1.4 million business while we were living in the house. I was doing that while your mother told dinner guests I should apply for a receptionist position. I was doing that while you nodded along and changed the subject. I was always doing more than you were paying attention to. That is not a new development. He opened his mouth. He closed it. His hand on the arm of the chair tightened and then released. Jeffrey said, my client would like to request an adjournment to review the full documentation. Valeria said, of course, we'll schedule a follow-up for 2 weeks from today. Daniel looked at the document one more time. Then he looked at me with the expression of a man who has just seen the whole shape of something he was standing too close to for years. He said, I should have been there. When you got the diagnosis, I should have been there. I let that sit for a moment. I said, yes, you should have. He looked at the table. He said, I'm sorry, Claire. I believed him. I want to be honest about that. I believed that he was sorry, in the way a person is sorry when the cost of a choice becomes undeniable. But sorry is not a renegotiation. Sorry is just an acknowledgement of arithmetic. I said, I know you are. And that was the last real conversation we had. The follow-up meeting produced an agreement in less time than Jeffrey Adler had likely anticipated. The proposed division that Valeria had outlined on page 12 was accepted with 2 minor modifications that she had already anticipated and built concession room for. The $1.4 million business remained entirely mine, which was always going to be the outcome given the documented legal structure. The marital property, the house, a joint investment account, and 2 vehicles was divided according to the standard guidelines, adjusted for the contributions each party had made, which were documented and which told a clear story. Daniel received his fair share. I want to be clear about that. I was not trying to destroy him. I was trying to leave accurately. The settlement was signed on a Tuesday in November. The sun came out. In the weeks that followed, I went through the remaining stages of my treatment with my sister, Nora beside me at the appointments that mattered, and with my own resources funding everything without disruption or negotiation or anyone else's permission. I was not fine every day. There were days that were hard in ways that had nothing to do with Daniel or the Ferreira family, days that were simply about the body and what it asks of you when you are asking something of it in return. But I got through them. I got through them the way I had always gotten through difficult things, by understanding the objective, managing the timeline, and trusting the people I had been careful enough to choose. Rosalind, from what I heard through Nora, who occasionally ran into people who knew people, was not graceful about any of it. She told family members that I had manipulated her son, that the prenuptial addendum had been some kind of trap, that she had always known I was calculating. What she could not explain, and what I understand gave her considerable difficulty, was why a calculating person would have spent 9 years quietly building something instead of doing whatever a trap was supposed to do. The math did not support the narrative, but Rosalind had never been especially interested in math. Marta stopped tilting her head at people for a while, or so I am told. Whether that lasted, I genuinely could not say. Tomas sent me a text 3 months after the settlement. It said I should have said something at those dinners. I hope you're well. I did not respond, but I kept it. It mattered more than he probably expected it to. Daniel eventually moved into an apartment closer to his mother's neighborhood. I heard he was doing all right. I believed that too, for whatever it was worth. I am doing all right myself. Treatment is behind me. My practice has expanded in ways that would probably astonish anyone who once suggested I look into receptionist work, not because I need them to be astonished, but because the work itself is genuinely interesting and I am good at it. And it turns out that those two things together are sufficient reason to keep going. Nora and I have dinner on Thursday nights now, a habit we picked up during treatment and could not bring ourselves to stop. She makes me laugh harder than anyone I know, and I think that might be the most important form of wealth I have. I live in a house that is mine, not ours. Mine. When I come home at the end of a day and unlock the front door and walk into my own kitchen and set my bag down on my own counter, I feel something that I did not have a word for a long time and that I eventually decided to just call peace. Not the absence of difficulty, not the end of hard days. Just the specific peace of a woman who knows what she built, and why, and what it cost, and who it belongs to now. My doctor uses the word remission. I use the word forward. Some people still say I went too far. That handing a man his divorce papers on the day I got a cancer diagnosis was excessive, or cruel, or strategically cold. They are entitled to that opinion. What I would ask them to consider is this. I had spent 9 years building something in a house where I was told, in small and consistent ways, that I was not capable of building anything. I had a diagnosis that reminded me, with considerable force, that time is not a renewable resource. And I had a husband who, when given the chance to be the person I needed him to be, chose a party. The papers were already prepared. The filing was already planned. The diagnosis did not create the decision. It simply removed the last reason to wait. So, did I go too far or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.